Okay, I want to do one more video before I go live today. So I'm posting this video now because these are going to be some of the things I'm going to talk about. I want to talk about the music industry too, but I think a lot of people that watch these channels, a lot of people are interested in recording and just getting better at recording. There are people that watch the channel that are really good at recording, and they're entertained by the videos because they can relate. There are various reasons why people watch the channel, but I've been eating peanuts, so I love these planter peanuts. I wanted to talk about this right quick because when I made my video, I made a couple of videos. One was about how I was reminiscing of my music and how it just went from steps from trying to do stuff in the barracks room when I was in the Army. How I was doing, working on my Sonic SQ1 Plus over here. And that's all I had was just one keyboard. Well, I had another one. I had it was like a low Roland D5. I had one of those too. But I didn't have hardly no gear. I didn't start building my actual physical recording studio and start buying gear until 2002. I went on recruiting duty, and I started buying gear. I started buying more keyboards. I started buying, I had a little mixer. And then from there, around 07, that's when I really, 06, 07, after I got back from Iraq, I really started buying, I bought these towers right here, these rack towers right here. Bought those in 07, and I started filling it up with rack gear. I was eBay heavy. And it progressed to what I got now. So, one thing that I do know, whether you work on, there's 3 types of mixers that we're usually working on. And it doesn't matter if it's a small format, tiny mixer, a medium format mixer, a medium console, or an actual physical large format recording console that, the $1 million ones, right? Signal has to flow through it. And the biggest difference between anything professional versus anything amateur is professional stuff gives you way more options because professional people have more choices to make. They have a lot more choices to make and decisions to make based on their situation. An amateur person or entry-level person doesn't know this. Like a professional knows, okay, what choices of mics I'm going to use, preamps, and so forth. They just know this from experience. An amateur doesn't know this. A novice doesn't know this to say, oh, wait a minute, this microphone is going to work better on this situation, or this preamp, or this amplifier, or this whatever, or these EQ settings work a lot better. And you start to learn. When you start getting into recording like I did, I got really heavily into studio recording in 1994. And that was my chance to actually go to an actual physical recording studio and really learn the recording studio process, which I was sold on. I was like, man, because I love when you create your own tracks and music. When you're in an amateur environment with amateur equipment, it's going to sound amateur, right? But when you start getting around an environment with better gear, better equipment, it starts to sound better. It starts to sound more and more professional. Key thing is the difference between a lot of recording studios that have been around since the 60s and 70s or whatever, and maybe people like us who get started later on. You start hearing about all these mixing engineers and these recording studios and all that is. They just had a lot more. They got started sooner, and they've been around gear longer. So to understand it. So when I'm looking at gear, or if I'm looking at a DAW, the first thing I do in a DAW definitely is I gotta look how the tracks, when you start setting up your auxiliary track, your audio tracks, or your instrument tracks or MIDI tracks, I like to look at the layout. So I'll go and I'll create a few audio tracks, maybe a few instrument tracks, maybe a few MIDI tracks, just to see how they're designed, how it's designed in the DAW. And then I start looking for key functions. I look at all the options at the top of the screen, you know, where you get most DAWs have the file and track and transport and about and all the preferences and all these different options at the top of the screen. But also, when you click on those, they give you a column of options. You know, like usually in the file, they usually give you the ability to import files, export files, and so forth. You can save as, and so forth. Then the next one might be an edit column where that's where you can copy or paste, and you can stuff like that. Or next one might be track, where you can add tracks, you know, delete tracks, and so forth. The next column might have something like view, where you can view different window options in your DAW. Another one might give you different options as far as being able to process the track, such as, you know, change the gain level on it or whatever. But then usually I'll take the mouse and I'll left and right click this to see what windows pop up, to see what gives you more options as far as editing. I do this in every DAW. And the next thing that I do is I look at the transport controller. It's like the same thing as if I was controlling a virtual. It's kind of like my BRC right here. My BRC, like you'll see in any DAW, like on a real controller, you know, you always have the stop, play, you know, record, rewind, fast forward. And then they give you options like to locate the track, rewind the track, name the track, arm the track, do everything from a controller. Well, they do that. They design those transporters in every DAW. Sometimes it's fixed at the top, sometimes it's the bottom. Sometimes you can separate to move it out the way. You know, all these different things. But the second thing I do is I look at the mixing console. I like to see if it has all the basic things, or am I going to have to am I going to have to add that stuff in? Like, does it already have a built-in gain in the mixing window? Does it have an EQ? Does it have a dynamics? Does it have places where you can insert gear, all your dynamics and stuff like that? Does it have? Most of these mixers are not going to have small and large faders, like for example, like some recording consoles that have small faders and big faders, because you're monitoring. A lot of times in the on your DAW, you're going to have the basic functions like you're going to have mute, solo, record. And sometimes there's another icon there it's a monitoring icon. You just got to click it. It turns it on to listen to stuff that's coming into the input of your audio interface, to listen to what you're going to record in the software. On a real console, they had to they would monitor to the small faders, and then they would direct from the small faders to the tape machine. And then they had the option to reverse them. But most people, like if they're on an SSL console, the signal flow would go something like this. They would have a couple of options. You know, you're going to have quite a few more options. Like, for example, they're going to, usually at the top is the routing matrix, where you can send a channel. You can click on that. Next one is where your built-in microphone preamp is at, your controls for it. And on, you know, a lot of times you could choose to use that. If you're not going to use the microphone preamp in the console, a lot of times you can just go to line, because you're going to bring in an outside source preamp through the channel, or you just don't need to use the mic preamp. So you can switch between the two, a mic or line. Mic levels and line levels are two different levels of volume. Mic levels or microphones are really low output. So the mic level, when you click the mic, makes it makes it the signal a lot harder so that it's a recordable level. Line levels are already hot levels. That's why they said that when you're trying to bring everything to line level. So microphones have to be boosted. That's why you need a preamp to boost the microphone, right? And then a lot of times it's just, there's always, there becomes the subjective, debatable, controversial version of which microphone preamp sounds better. Some people say, nah, API has better mic preamp sounds than Neves, or Neves or SSLs, or this is where you get into the debate of the, and they're talking about physical coloring of the sound. In other words, each preamp makes a sound that the engineer is looking for. I love the color of that preamp, or no, I like this one. It's a clean sounding preamp. It doesn't color at all, meaning iron type transformers or nickel type it's a whole. This gets let me stay on track. So it's going to flow through one of that part of the console. Then the next thing is you have the option to go straight to the fader to control the volume that's coming in. And then what's happening is they always have, at the fader level, there's always, you can solo that to listen to that fader by itself. You can have PFL, which stands for pre-fader listen. That's listen to what's coming into the channel. Pre-fader listen. That's what's going to, before you even start messing with the fader. You can listen to it and say, do I like the sound of that signal? Or that, so you hit the PFL button. Pre-fader listen. Now I don't like the way that sounds. Let me go back and change some stuff. And you could change it out before you. But a lot of times it's going to come to the fader. And you can, then after that, you can direct from the fader, you can direct it out. You can pan it to the left. That's going to come out from that channel. You can pan it to the left to go to the left single, to the right, or whatever. And so forth. There's also a couple of other options on the, there's more options on the larger consoles. Like some of these faders can move by themselves. Like Neve, they call flying faders, but basically they just, Neve wanted to call them flying faders. SSL calls them automation, or whatever. They all both can physically move. You probably see digital consoles or they're all moving by themselves or whatever. They're just motorized faders that's being controlled by a unit in the console or an external unit. So, but along that path, you have the option to engage an EQ on that channel if you want. If you want to use the channel's EQ, you just got to push the. Okay, I want to use that channel, so I'm gonna engage the EQ. Now it's gonna go from the preamp section into the EQ. And a lot of times you have the filter options as well. You have a high pass filter and a low pass filter. Some people, they hear this term, but they may not know what HPF or HPF or LPF stands for, or what exactly does it mean. And high pass filter means it's only going to let higher frequency signals pass through. So that means it's going to cut out all low end. And you just got to set the frequency to the high pass filter that it's going to let. So in other words, the more advanced and more professional board, the more options to control that. Some boards don't give you the option to control the low end that you want to cut out. It's already fixed. So, like for example, you hit the HPF button on this console, it cuts out all 100 frequencies or less. Well, you and I know the bass guitar and bass drum and kick usually operates in that frequency range. But why do they do that? If that's the case, why do they have HPF if you don't want to cut certain low end frequencies off? Because you don't want one thing in mixing is you don't want frequencies competing with each other. You don't want the keyboard's low end competing with the guitar's low end and competing with the bass tones. So you high pass filter the guitar Especially if a guitar, especially, you know, a lot of times you have guitar players playing on that low E string. You'll still be able to hear him playing the E string, but you don't want that low end harmonics of the low end E string. You don't want that. You just want the low end to be clean on the guitar, because the bass guitar is already covered in those frequencies, so you can distinguish the two. Same thing with keyboard patches, especially Fender Rhodes or keyboard patches. The low end frequencies of the lower notes of the keys can compete with the bass guitar. You still want to hear those low end notes that the keyboard is playing, but you imply a high pass filter. It's the same thing with vocals. Sometimes you have a really low singing baritone bass guy. He's singing low on the bass. You don't want that low end competing with lower frequencies of like the bass and so forth. And there's another thing, there's a couple other things that a lot of you hear terms. You're going to hear a lot of these terms like expander, exciter. You're going to hear side chain, mid chain, and so forth. There's a lot of reasons why you'll start to see all these functions on this gear. And you're like, man, what do they use side chain for? What do they use mid side chain for? Tube saturation. You start, expander versus exciter. You know, like what's an or? Why these guys have aural exciters? An aural exciter is not an EQ. It really isn't. But it does stuff to frequencies. That's a different, so anyhow, so you with the signal flowing is coming from in the console through the preamp section. Almost everything does. When you send something into a console, it's got to go through the preamp section. Whether you can bypass the preamp or whatever. Some consoles you can't bypass the preamp. But you're going to go through the preamp section, and a lot of times the line you just got, and there's buttons on to engage that. Like on like SSLs, there are a lot of, you see some of those switches, but some of the switches actually pull up and pull down to engage it. There's also a lot of buttons on there to turn it on. Like, you have moving on. So from next, once it leaves the EQ section, a lot of times there's a dynamic section on some of these consoles. They have built-in gates. The gate can act as a gate versus an expander. An expander is basically a quieter. Is that such a word, right? Is a quieter. So what's going to happen is a gate is just a gate. It's a door. It's a signal door. You turn on the gate. It's basically it's a mute button. It's a mute function. The only difference between a mute on the actual channel to mute the channel and the gate is you can set when do you want the gate, and we call this a threshold. So once the signal drops below wherever you set your threshold, in other words, if you go below, and if you ever the first thing I would tell anyone to understand volume or dB, you gotta remember it's doing the same thing. A lot of times I'm bringing the frame up, I'm boosting the volume, but no, what you're really doing, this is why most mixers automatically bring the volume to unity or 0. What you're doing is you want to already have volume. You already want to have volume. So you're going to set your gain. This is what we call gain staging or gain structure, right? You want to set a nice line or nice hot signal without distortion. That's why you want to look at your dB level and have that's why they want you to have plenty of gain but still leave some headroom before it starts to distort. We call this headroom, right? So you want to have some space in there, but you want the signal to be hot enough so that way it's coming in without creating unnecessary noise. It's called noise floor. The hotter you can get the signal without distortion, yet leave headroom, yet have no noise, you're in a good recording stage, right? So from that, once you get a good, nice signal, and once it leaves the preamp, and if you're going to engage the EQ or not, it's going to the fader. From the fader, unless you want to use the dynamics, you have the option to engage dynamics. This is the reason why you'll see on and off switches on the consoles like that. you could turn the EQ on and off. You can also turn the dynamics on and off. So, but the preamp, you just gotta make the choice, line or mic. From there, it's going to the fader. Unless you want to use the EQ or onboard dynamics, you might want to use an external preamp or an external dynamic, or you might want to blend the two. It's all your option. Some mixing engineers say, I'm not going to use the EQ on the console, or I'm not going to use the dynamics on the console. I got some external choices. That's why they always saying, you always hear these terms from these studio engineers. I want to give, it's like a palette, a color palette. It's basically options or choices of signal sound for the engineer. No, I don't want to use the preamp in this Allen Heath. I got my Avalon or my Joe Meets or my Universal Audio or my Altron Neve style or my Arts or my Personases, and the list just goes on of all these preamps that I got. All these different preamps. I'm going to use those flavor of preamps and not the consoles. Just to change the flavor. This is what gives a professional options. There's the These people used to say what they would criticize because I have a bad habit of saying So you have the choice to engage the EQ or your choice to use an external EQ. Same thing with the dynamics. If not, it's coming to the fader. Then from there, a lot of times you can route that channel through bus options. On some consoles they're down by the fader. Other consoles they're up at the top in front of the preamp. A lot of times I put a preamp, so I want to route that to go somewhere else on the console. Like on this route, it goes to already set of preset faders here, and the master fader volume knobs for the master buses are in the center. Where the mask for faders. Other than that, from there you're also going to come from the fader. It's going to auxiliaries because these are routing. These are outs. The auxiliaries and buses are to send it out from the channel. So usually, also on the consoles, you have the choice to. When they set these consoles up, they send every possible input and output of the console. They route that to a patch bay. So a lot of times instead of going and climbing behind a patch bay or behind the mixer to insert gear to buses, auxiliaries, inserts, you go to the patch bay. My patch bay is over there. You go to that patch bay and then you just plug in that way. You have a lot of people that will have a mixing console. They're always climbing behind there to insert gear on the channel. That's tedious. That can be tedious. It's easier just to go to the patch bay. Well, the auxiliaries, same thing with your auxiliary outs. That's routed to a patch bay, so you don't have to plug stuff into the auxiliary of the console. Like my auxiliaries are on my patch bay. My buses are on my patch bay. My inserts, my bus inserts, I haven't set up all my inserts per channel yet. It's coming. Because it's 48 channels. That means 48 cables. But that's the signal flow of consoles. So when you understand that, so it's kind of like this. I have a signal coming into a channel. It could be a kick drum, snare drum, hi-hats, whatever. It doesn't matter if it's coming from your live room or you've already recorded stuff into your DAW. And let's say you have an audio interface that has, like my Antelope has, you can do 32 outputs. I have 24 outputs coming out, just like my Motu, my 24 AI. Let me turn because I'm about to go get something to eat before I go live. Let me turn this down. Okay. So, with that being said, once it's coming through your preamp, you have the option to engage the EQ. You have the option to engage gates or reverb or or if your console has it, you have options to engage the the gate slash expander slash compressor. I was talking about gate and expander. I got off topic, didn't I? The difference, a gate's a door. So you can turn, what happens is, anything, when you set the threshold of your signal, like we go unity, right? Which is, then you'll look, if you look at your numbers on your fader, and we call them long faders, you'll see 0, then you start to see like -10, -20, -30, all the way down to, then there's a little Q where infinity means, that means infinity, which means the signals, there's no signal. You turn it to infinity, or basically there's nothing coming through, because you reduced all signal coming through it. But as you slowly increase going slowly to unity, you are unrestricting the signal. So the signal is going to get louder and louder till it reaches unity. Well, let's say on a compressor slash gate and all that is, on a compressor, the compressor's looking for that signal, right? The compressor's saying, okay, I need to see the signal so I can compress it. So what's happening is, as you bring the fader up, this is the same concept, even though I'm using my analog console, it's the same concept in your DAW. As I bring my fader up, if I engage a compressor or I insert a compressor, it's going to look for that signal. The difference is, on a compressor is, it's like these numbers represent the threshold. It's the thresh. It's holding. It's almost like, think of it like if you ever been to a Greyhound track, and all the dogs are in those little gated thing, those little gated cages, and there's a clock time. Once the clock time hits 0 and the gates open, boom, the dogs can take off. The same thing with signal. Once it sees the threshold, the gates open. Now the compressor, not gonna compress. You just have to set the threshold. I want my threshold to kick in once as my signal comes up to, like, let's say -30 or -20, whatever the case, it's gonna start compressing before it's gonna start compressing. That's what a compressor is. The threshold is, that's the key point of a compressor, to start compressing. Now you'd have to set how much it's gonna compress and how fast it's gonna compress, and the release is how fast you hear what it's compressed, that signal. And then if it starts to get a little lower than what you thought, you make it up with the makeup gain, right? This is why all compressors have those 5 key components: the threshold, when am I going to see the signal? Okay, the ratio, how much input versus how much I'm going to let out. I'm going to let a little of the signal out. So for every 4, or let's say you got 4-to-1, for every 4 dBs of gain that went in, I'm only gonna let 1 out. So it's all that signal's trying to squeeze into, it's kind of like a big crowd trying to go, a big crowd of people trying to go through one small door. The door is the ratio. There's only one person can go through the door, right? You got 5 people trying to go through this door. Only one can go through, so they gotta start letting people, only 1 in, 1 out, through these doors. You're trying to squeeze all these 5, so think of that as amount of signal people, right? So after that, how fast can these people get through this door? It's called the attack. I'm going to attack this door, right? Well, it's microseconds or nanoseconds. I'm going to attack this door real quick. Or I'm just going to kind of take my time. That's a slower attack. I don't want, and the reason being, because let's say the guy is doing this through the door. He's making all this noise going through the door. We call this transients, right? He's making all these noise and all that. You're trying to, hold up, guy. I don't want to hear all, I want to hear some of that, but not all of it, right? So it's depending on how much you want to hear all that extra transient stuff, like the resonance of a snare, right, or whatever. Or the wood or the metal pieces of the snare, all these noises, transients. along with the snare signal. So I want to take it fast. I want to make it slower so I can hear some of that. Because it's going to compress based on how much you're going to let. I might only one in, one out. I might 8 4 in, but only one's coming out. I might 8 can come in, only one coming out. That's the compression. That's the So a limiter means I don't care how much you coming in. This is the max coming out. I've limited how many people can come out of this compressor. How much signal come out, right? The gate and expander operates the opposite. So let's say I set my threshold at -30, even though I'm bringing my signal to unity. -30, the compressor kicks in. So I got my unity, but it's not as loud enough versus if I turn the compressor off. I let the compressor off, and now I got max amount of gain coming through that to that fader at unity. The compressor's only going to squash so much of that out. I can't. So let me turn my makeup gain to get it back as hot as it was before I used the compressor. I got to turn the makeup gain up, and now you're going to hear a more compressed sound. A gate is the opposite. So let's say once the signal stops or drops below, I want the gate to kick in at -30. Ideal is, when do I want the gate to kick in? So it cuts the signal off. A lot of times we use gate because we want to control bleed. We don't want extra stuff bleeding through. So I'm gonna put a gate on it. So let's say I put my gate at -40. So once the signal stops, as the signal drops, once it drops below 30, once the compressor gonna stop, and then once it drops go to 40, the compressor's gonna kick in, the gate's gonna cut off before the signal drop down to unity, right? An expander, all it does is say, yeah, it does the same thing as a gate, but it just says it takes its time. It's like a gate instant. Expander, like, yeah, you can hear, but it's just slowly getting quieter. You could hear this little ka, versus you had some ka. Versus a gate, ka. Once I bring the signal up, above -40, ka. Ka. Versus an expander, ka. Right? So, man, I'm 30-something minutes. Okay, so that's the flow, right? So I can engage this. I can gauge these functions: EQ, the gate, expander, and all that. That's why you see this on the SSL consoles or pieces of external gear. From there, once it goes from the fader, like an SSL, you get the option to go to the small fader to the big fader. Most times it's small fader, so I can monitor before I go to my taping machine. Then once the output of my tape machine, it's going to come back, but this time it's routing to the big fader. So now I don't even have to worry about the small faders, because now I'm ready to mix. So I'm going to use the big faders to mix. I'm going to use the small faders to record to the console. Sometimes people could reverse it, because sometimes they like to mix to tape. I'm not big on that. There's engineers that do that. I'm not big on that. I don't recommend doing that, but everyone has their unique way of recording and mixing. So now, once you got your signal the way you want, you got it coming through the preamp section. If you got to use EQ, you got that set the way you want it. You got your gates and compressor and expanders set. And I was going to fader. Now I'm going to route it out somewhere else on the board to be used. I'm going to route it to a bus, or I'm going to route it to an auxiliary to send it to like an effect processor, or I'm going to route it out to send it to like my live room to send it to my musicians so they can hear, like we call them cues. I'm going to send it there, or I'm going to send it to, if you were running a live situation, I'm going to send out my auxiliaries to stage monitors. So I'm going to route out auxiliaries out of the console to go to like stage monitors or headphone mixes or effect processors, delays, reverbs units and stuff like that. Or I'm going to send it to speakers that can, let's say I got a chamber where I got speakers in a chamber room. So I'll run my auxiliary. What it's doing is send signal to a set of speakers coming from the console to a set of speakers in a chamber room or a plate room or whatever, or a made up reverb room, a hall or whatever. I got speakers in there. And then I got another set of microphones to listen to that to come back into the console on a different channel. Instant reverb, right? That was old school, very before we start getting rack units and digital processor plugins. So it's routing out, and then it's returning back to the board. The bus channels, everything's routed out because eventually, the object, once you've done all that, is to come to the master output section. So all that's going to route out, but come back into the board to come back out, because it's all going to come out through the master section. And the final master is the master bus. That's the main bus that's going to be captured from everything that you've done through the console. The master out is what's going to reprint the final. I've said all that because your DAW's mixer is automatically defaulted to master. You have to understand the signal flow and understand the routing and how everything routes, and then you have to make sure that it's going to return to your master bus, because that's your print bus. That's what you're hearing through the speakers. Everything that you're doing through all the channels, auxiliaries, and buses should be heard through your master. Your master bus, which is going to be your print bus, is linked to your speakers because you're listening to what you're going to print. A lot of times, the old school way, 1/2 inch 2-track master, the output of that would go to the 2-track master. The master's already on your DAW. What's coming out of your master fader on your DAW master channel bus is what's going to print. So a lot of times, even though you're doing everything in the tracks and on the channels, you think you're really hearing the channels. And the only way you can hear that channel by itself and not come to the master is to direct it out of the console or direct it out of the DAW into an external listening source like speakers. But that is not ideal. You want to listen to your master bus. So a lot of times when you're listening to stuff in your DAW, it's defaulted to master. That's why if you look at the bottom of your channel in your DAW, it says master. It means going to the master bus. That's what you're hearing. That's why if you turn you can have all your signals coming through all the channels can be going. LEDs can be moving. And you look at the master bus. If you bring the volume or mute the master or bring the volume down on the master, the signal's going to cut off. So we're going to talk about this because this, let me see. Yeah, it's going on 40 minutes. I'm going to talk about this more in details. People are going to ask all these questions. They're probably going to ask all these questions about routing, because that's why routing is so important. That's why routing is so important. This is why routing is so important when it comes to how the stuff is going to sound. The routing and how things are routed through your DAW is what's going to determine how it's going to sound. So that's going to do it for this video. I'll look for you to watch this channel, watch this video, because I'm about to run to Arby's right quick. Thank God it's like literally like the next block over. Give me a roast beef sandwich. And we're live stream be coming. I'm gonna start at 8 o'clock, and I look for people to see you there. All right, we'll see you then. Thanks for watching.